Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to everybody for this discussion on Mr. Sood's book, The Unending Game. I'm actually standing in for my colleague Harsh Pant, who was supposed to chair this today, but he is indisposed, so it's fallen on me, and it's my honor actually, because Mr. Sood has been both a mentor and a friend, but a friend who doesn't talk very much. And since he doesn't talk very much, when he told me that he was writing his book, or rather he had finished his book, so I said, hell, he has probably disclosed everything in his book which he has never spoken to me about. But I think more than the mafia, he keeps the oath of omerta with him. And that is why, for many people, the book would be a bit of a disappointment if they were expecting the masala. Now, this is a problem with some of the really good Indian intelligence officers. The books they've written has no masala. Uh, and some of the not so good intelligence officers, the books they have written has a lot of masala, but a lot of nonsense also. So, Mr. Sood, congratulations, because it's a very good book. It's a very good book because if you read between the lines, there's a lot of information in this book, and that is, I think, Mr. Sood's or always has been his modus operandi. Uh, what is more important is that it gives you an insight into how one of the top intelligence officers in India was thinking. What are the issues which bother him? How does he join the dots? How does he look at the world? And that, to my mind, was one of the more interesting aspects of the book. Uh, the uh, the other thing which is very interesting about the book is how it's very forward looking. He's not delving into the history, but also looking ahead about the new challenges intelligence agencies are going to face, how they need to restructure, because in this day and age today of cryptocurrencies and what have you, old style intelligence organizations are anachronisms. And when Mr. Sood talks about how intelligence agencies need to dip into specialists from various fields, economists and businessmen and all sorts of other people, technologists. I think that is something which governments, at least in India, elsewhere probably they do take it seriously, but I think in India we have been lagging behind on some of these issues because the hybrid war of this day and age cannot be done in the old cloak and daggers way. It has to be done in far more sophisticated ways. So the book is an excellent book, and I'm sure Mr. Sood is going to talk about the book. And we have two other panelists, Mr. Adrian Levy, whose books I'm sure many of you must have read, and some of his books. Actually, he has this ability to write a book on the most serious issues and make it sound like a novel. And it's racy reading, it's great reading, very well documented. But I love the writing style, and it's always very compelling reading his books. And then, of course, my favorite foreign affairs correspondent in this country, Indrani Bagchi, who doesn't hold any punches when she takes them, and she takes them quite often. She took them today, in fact, in her Twitter account. But I asked her a question, which I'm going to ask her again. That what is it about India? And this question is also for Mr. Sood. What is it about India that a country with the population less than Greater Kailash Part 1, the leader of that country thinks he can cock a snook at India and get away with it? And while Mr. Sood is answering that question, I also want to ask him, because there's a lot of speculation today that his erstwhile organization, a mother organization, is actually able to make people win elections. So maybe if he wants to talk about how you managed to do that. So we'll set the ball rolling. I'll ask Mr. Sood to say what he has to say, and then we'll have the other panelists, and after that, we'll have a Q&A.
You, Sushant, for your introduction and for saying the nice things that I told you to say for me. And thank you for that.
You were not supposed to disclose that.
Thanks a lot. And it encourages the next person to talk a bit more about himself and his book. Actually, my book is not about me. It's not about even the R&AW, except when it is relevant to the issue I'm talking about. It's not even about the ISI. So all those masalas have been taken out, and what you're left with is perhaps for many not so interesting. It's not breaking news stories. Uh, it's not also meant for the pure professional exclusively. My whole idea of writing this book is to tell the averagely interested Indian what or how an intelligence organization works and thinks and what are its problems and what we can do. It's about the past, that's the present and the future. Or shall I say, it's first part is the theory of intelligence, external intelligence. The second part is how the intelligence organizations the world over function. And the third is looking ahead, looking at the future. When I tell stories or anecdotes about various spies, the idea is to tell you that this is how all intelligence agencies work, including ours. So it's not as if I will name anybody, but it's for you to see. It's, as Sushant said, reading between the lines. Uh, I thought I would, in today, sort of highlight two or three things that particularly interested me, and I wrote about it. And one is, as Adrian and I discussed last night also at another book discussion, the deep state. What is the deep state? Because intelligence collection is not just about raising sources, collecting intelligence, analyzing it, and feeding it to the consumer. It's more than that. It's what the Russians, the Soviets used to call active measures. It's what we call covert operations. So do the Americans. And covert operations are not just aggressive, combative operations. These are long-term operations which have total deniability. So we don't even talk about covert operations, really. What I'm going to talk about is how the deep state came into being and how it now stands in the world stage. The term was actually first used as a deep state was in 1996 when in Turkey there was a car accident and the passengers were the chief of the intelligence, the chief of the mafia, the Turkish mafia, the gangsters Mol, and Mol, not Mol, and the fourth one was the Turkish Kurdish Marxist Party leader. All four in the same car, traveling together, and they had in the boot grenades and automatic weapons. They were being supplied to somebody. So there the press started calling it how the deep state works. Actually, in the West, in America particularly, you've always had this, what Eisenhower first called in 1956 or 52, the military-industrial complex. How the two of them combined to determine policy, industry, even trade. Then it has evolved from there to now in the internet age, in the communication age. I expand this further to say the military, industry, technology, intelligence, communication industry. This all together, they work together to run the show as it, the deep state. There's some very nice definitions of the deep state. May I just read it from the book? I think definitions are best acceptable when they're defined by the nationals of that country themselves. Peggy Noonan, writing in the Wall Street Journal in 2013, said she wondered if in 2013, if the US did not have what amounts to a deep state within the outer state in the US, A deep state consisting of our intelligence and security agencies, which are so vast and far-flung in their efforts that they themselves don't fully know who's in charge and what everyone else is doing. Maybe they're bugging so many people, it's hardly news to them when they bug the Chancellor of Germany. Maybe they mentioned it to the President. Maybe not. Maybe they don't even know. So it is how amorphous, how deep, how silent it is in many ways. And it was Larry Pressler who called it the octopus in his book, Neighbors in Arms. He says that Pressler explains how this octopus exists and thrives in the US, how it protects the interests of the few while appearing to act for the many. It has been the progression of the Pinay Circle and the Bilderberg Group to the military-industrial complex that General Eisenhower warned about, to the military-industrial technological intelligence complex that I have mentioned just now. I've ended my book about the future, having talked about how technology is going to change the way we function, the way we live, the way intelligence will operate, the threats that it will have, the problems that it will have, to match with this massive flow of information, which is just information, it is not intelligence. How are the intelligence agencies ever going to work on that? Because usually the political consumer expects shotgun or instant coffee reports. He wants results now. 30-year forecasts don't interest him. Even 5-year forecasts don't interest him. They only want to know what's in it tomorrow. Where is the threat tomorrow or today? Nothing else. So the tendency is to concentrate only on this and forget the long-term pictures. That is something the intelligence agencies will have to contend with in the future. For India, that's my last paragraph of the book. The old threats will remain and new ones will arise in unimaginable and unpredictable ways. Any intelligence service that begins to understand what lies ahead and what should be done now to prepare itself for the future will have better chances of providing answers. The tasks for present-day intelligence managers are much more difficult and diffuse than they were in the somewhat placid days of the 1970s. That's when I began my career. This is the unasked for inheritance of the intelligence world. They have to continue to play this endless game where there are few rules and no winners. I now leave it to the moderator to...
But you haven't answered my question about what happened in Sri Lanka and what happened in Maldives.
Was it a serious question to me?
I
I have no idea what's going on these days.
But if you put your thinking cap on, what do you think happened? Or it was the victory of the population?
I think it's the victory of the population.
Excellent. Mr. Levy?
Hello there. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel. I'm really pleased to be here because it's a great book. There's nothing worse than being on a panel with a lousy book. And this is a really good book. It's beautifully succinct. It is not overlong. And I mean that as huge praise because I think Mr. Sood has a way of condensing very complex ideas down into very simple sentences, which belie the amount of thought and depth there is in it. That may be his personal trait. I think the book is all the better for the absence of masala. I think it's contending with some very serious issues which are tucked away at the back. And if you make it to the end, which you will because of the way it's written, there is an appeal at the back of this book which I think will resound in India. I hope it does resound. It's been written to resound for the kind of reform that needs to happen. And that section is beautifully written and well argued. A call for a different kind of non-sclerotic service, which would encourage more movements, more professionalism, tapping into area and subject experts, particularly in linguistics, languages, regional specialists, and technological expertise as well. That's very, very well expressed. But also he touches on some areas which we could refer to frivolously, and two areas which are very serious. Yesterday, when we talked together about the book, I thought it was unfair that he, in one sense, had beautifully and succinctly accounted for the rise of the deep state in the West, partially in the West, and yet had not done so in India. And so I said to him, who is the deep state in India? And the second question that came to mind, which is really the partner, the brother or sister of that question, is who is the military-industrial complex in India? Now, of course, that question is easier to answer, and I'll leave it to you to answer both of those. Yep. And I think it's well worth matching that understanding and your projection on that to what you've written about the European experience. But also, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of other areas. There are massive rivals to intelligence right now. Intelligence, as in the classically defined agencies that provide internal and external intelligence to countries, are no longer doing so simply on their own. They have rivals, as we discussed together, in social media. And social media confabulations, enormous companies that track our every movements, particularly thinking of Google, but also in terms of all social media platforms, what they know about us individually through macro data, GPS data, and our own selling of our own private information as entertainment is obviously a rival to internal intelligence and also useful to external intelligence. And we can see the effects that had with Cambridge Analytica and the way in which that information was used and targeted and has been done much more successfully by Russia. And to be fair, America and Britain and other European countries had done the same against the Soviet Union and against Russia post the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the Cambridge Analytica example is a really important one because narrow margins win elections right now. And particularly in contentious areas like Brexit in the UK, it's easier to heat up a debate which in itself will fall down to single-digit votes, pretty much when it comes down to it. So intelligence rivalry is one area. And another area that I think he's touched on but really rings home to me is noise. Because right now there's a lot of truth out there, i.e. there's a lot of people who are purveyors of truth. And they have many more platforms than they've ever had to put their narratives out there and to reach you, you can mainline on truth now straight away with a broadband connection. And people will tell you stuff which looks attractive. If you look right now at the proliferation of fantasists who operate on self-penned blogs and platforms like Medium, it's very hard to counter the narratives or even check them. The war that's being fought right now over who did what in Syria is a really great example of that. So we would have a classic scenario where a chemical attack happens, and then one section of the internet will immediately say it's a false flag operation by the CIA, and another section will say, actually, the OPCW has a combination of air, ground, eyewitness statements, etc. And its 360-degree picture shows that this, in fact, was a weapon of sorts let off. And then you'll get the co-opting of a journalist, which is mixed into this new world of confabulation, and that happened with Seymour Hersh. So a man who had been great in the past was co-opted to be the front man for the story and offload the good news that the CIA had mounted a false flag attack, detonating a chemical weapon inside Syria. And he won an award for it, and the award, which was created, he's the first recipient of that award, had the title of Orwell in the name of that award, which in itself just further adds to the incredulity of the lie within the lie within the lie, a Matryoshka doll of lies that takes place. And for anybody, whether you be an intelligence agent, a journalist, a thinker, to actually get to the truth amongst the din of truths that are out there is a nightmare on a daily basis, let alone if you're a children, the age of my own children, who are navigating the internet to find information and constantly coming back to me with stories that are barely believable and yet take the form of essays that then appear as history. So they're my immediate comments in response. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for writing the book.
Thank you. Thank you, Levy. I don't think there's a deep state in India. I think what is goes for deep state is what is nowadays called Lutyens Delhi, but I can't think of any other deep state out here. But on the intelligence rivalry and the multiple truths which are floating around, I don't know. It was always there. This kind of disinformation, misinformation, campaigns. Maybe the nature has changed and the intensity has changed. The speed is there, but it's always been done. When have what the Russians did with the Americans is what the Americans have done with a whole lot of other people in the past, and everybody has done this with everybody else. Whoever can do it wherever they do it. So I don't know how much it actually changed the election results in the US. I don't think there's any quantifiable assessment of that. But having said that, the floor is yours, Indrani.
Uh, Thank you, Sushant. Like you, when I picked up the book, I was equally excited. I thought, okay, there are many questions that I may have asked, or I may have just thought, or I may not even have thought of, which will be answered in this book. Needless to say, you get more out of Mr. Sood over a drink and a cup of coffee than in the book. So, but having said that, it's a fascinating book because even though he doesn't spill any secrets, you do get, as Adrian said, you do get to the end of the book. And a couple of things stand out, and I will go back to the idea of the deep state. But there was one thing that Mr. Sood mentioned, which was early on, which was the importance of strategic communication, and I cannot emphasize that more. Covering the not the deep state, but covering the foreign policy environment as I do and have been for the last couple of decades. But I do, why I think that's important is it saves the bureaucrat a lot of trouble. Early on in my beat, when I first started this beat, I remember sitting with a joint secretary in the MEA who pulled out a sheaf of papers which he said was it had top secret written on them. The the topmost document on that in that file was a newspaper clipping, and I I swear to you, my respect for the deep state increased immensely. But fast forward to no. The thing is, we as a fourth estate, we invariably come across more information without the tech int and the human and all of that. Just by walking through corridors and talking to people, you do end up with a lot more information. I have to say, collecting information has become a lot easier, lot easier today for journalists of today than it was. When we first started, because there was no internet, I couldn't Google and find out complex answers to complex questions in those days. So I had to depend on sundry joint secretaries who felt charitable that morning to explain to me what I had asked without him saying to me, "You are an idiot." And I have had far too many of them saying that to me. But anyway, having weathered all that, you fast forward to Doklam last year. An essential aspect of what I thought was new age covert operation I saw happening right in front of me. And I'd say that was the Chinese three warfare strategy, which again I didn't know until somebody pointed it out to me. And it has three elements. And the Chinese actually they activated all three elements beautifully. The elements being media warfare, psychological warfare, and a legal warfare. So if you break it down, the media warfare was pretty evident, right? The Chinese were the barrage of nasty stories from the Chinese media was quite amusing for us, because in all the years past, it was we used to get calls from MEA to say, the Chinese are complaining that y'all are too nasty and too aggressive, etc. And this time there was complete silence on the Indian side, and the Chinese were at it, hammer and tongs, including, I don't know if any of you saw this outstanding video of a Chinese Sikh. The Chinese Sikh who had lots of interesting things to do and say. So that was the media warfare. The psychological warfare, of course, I am, please remember where you are. You are I'm 5 times your size, and that kind of intimidation. The legal warfare was even better, which was, please remember the laws, the rules, or the Treaty of 1913, 1890, remember 1962, and there was a suddenly everybody was running to the nearest library to find out what happened in the Treaty of 1913. Honestly, none of that mattered. But the fact is that they tried it all. And it was I would say, a textbook example of how to conduct a covert operation using modern tools, open source, and none of the cloak and dagger stuff. We don't compliment ourselves enough that we did not fall for it, that we did not, that there was almost no pushback. And because, why was there, last year we were told, why is it that you people are so quiet? Why is the Indian government quiet? Why are they not? But when you think back, somebody was thinking, obviously, in the Indian system, because once you refused to engage with that warfare, that instantly lost its relevance, and it lost its resonance, and it was remarkable. And I don't know how many, maybe I'm sure scholars will look at it in future years to come or whatever. But if you just look at how the Chinese did a similar activity in the Philippines, and they sort of employed a similar template in India, then you get a sense of what are the new kinds of tools that the game is played with. And we are, as Adrian correctly said, we are a tool. We are the fourth estate journalists are a tool in the game. And often we find ourselves either at the receiving end of what we call plantations, which is stories, ideas, etc., planted. Sometimes you take them, sometimes you don't. But to actually advance an ideology, or to advance a theory, or to advance a point of view of a state, journalists have been used for this for years, and I suspect will continue to be used for years. I would, if you look at Maldives today, and here is Sushant's answer to Sushant's question, which he posed on Twitter this morning. The point is that we don't have a copyright on ambition. The leader of Greater Kailash One can have ambitions. It is up to us as a bigger power to be able to secure our interests without imposing costs on the ordinary person. And I think that was a huge challenge for us in this past year. And I have written myself, and I think all of us have written at various times about how utterly ineffectual and effete the Indian government was in the face of the kind of provocation that we kept seeing from Maldives. sometimes you look back and think maybe it was a good thing, but at that moment it doesn't feel like a good thing at all. Having said that, today we do have an interesting result in Maldives, but I would say, we have to learn to be a little more mature about our own region, because if we think that tomorrow morning it will be a bright new beginning with Maldives, I don't see it that way. Our biggest challenge in Maldives was the Chinese challenge. I don't see that challenge going away anywhere. They have a debt, they need infrastructure, they need to balance us, all three combined. And I don't see the Chinese, and Chinese have this incredible stickiness to wherever they go. They just don't leave. You look at Sri Lanka. 3 years after a new government came in, they're deeper in bed with the Chinese. So, then the job of Mr. Sood's tribe actually becomes much more important, and therefore my question to Mr. Sood is not the deep state, is the service, is the intelligence complex able to or trained to address or predict or game out scenarios in the modern world that we did not anticipate even 5 years ago. And I don't know, I mean, maybe there is a set of people in the Indian system that are actually being trained to do this. I don't see them, but I'm sure I hope they are there. But as he mentions in his epilogue, which, by the way, is actually the place where Mr. Sood is most visible. And but as he says, you need that, you need the economist, you need the finance number cruncher, you need the person to understand algorithms, and you need somebody to understand all these new technologies to be able to look beyond the horizon. And I don't know whether we are training, we keep thinking of ourselves as the counterpoint to the ISI. And the ISI runs a state like Pakistan. It is still a low-tech operation. The new world is not a low-tech operation anymore. And even our region, which is still backward, still poor, etc., is even that is no longer low-tech. All you have to do is to watch the terrorists who blew up the Holy Artisan Bakery in Dhaka 2 years ago. They were communicating with each other not via Telegram, the app, but via a completely different app, which the Bangladesh their RAB, they had no clue. They actually had to Google it, called Threema, and. They were completely clueless how this whole system of worked. But if you ask a 7-year-old child who has a Snapchat account, they know how it works. So this it was then that they woke up. You wake up every day. You're waking up to a completely different threat. And while as journalists, we look at these things evolving, and we are a bit of distance away. We have the luxury of being able to say the Indian government screwed up in such and such place, but Mr. Sood's tribe doesn't have that luxury of being able to say that. And I will stop on this note, but I do have that last question for Mr. Sood: is where is our deep state?
I think before we throw it open to the floor, you answer that questions and
Deep state bothers all of us, but let me say that you also asked this, Adrian, and so has Indrani. The deep state is, to me, an outgrowth of the military-industrial complex, where you have confluence of interest in trying to preserve a particular way of life. It's rich, it's powerful, and it depends on sales of a particular kind. Therefore, it needs to have wars somewhere else so that you can make goods and sell them and replenish them. Now, in India, we didn't have an industrial complex really when we had independence. We had several public sector undertakings. We didn't have the private sector apart from Birla and maybe Tata. And I don't think of any other big corporation that was Indian. So we didn't have that industry. And we moved straight on to state economies. And so that knocked out, and our army, it was not the army that would venture out of the borders. It was restricted to itself. Nope. The Indian ordnance factories at one stage was making pressure cookers, I'm told. Isn't that right? In the days of Krishna Menon or somewhere, yes, that they were making, yeah. They were making pressure cookers. So we didn't have that kind of an arrangement for the military industrial complex to grow. Now, with globalization, with everything else changing, and we have offsets and so on and so forth, when production is going to be done privately, and there is already a lot of noise about Rafale. So now you can see the coming of the military industrial complex. When that happens, there will be a deep state, which will comprise the wealthy, the rich, the powerful, and the politician, and a section of the intelligence. Then you will have a deep state. Right now, we have, as Sushant says, we got the Lutyens Club, or whatever else you might call it. Powerful people, contractors who give opinion and nothing else. They have no other contribution to make. So the deep state is in the making. So far, we've had dynasties, though. And your question, you'd asked me about the future and how you talked about whether we are preparing ourselves for the kind of future that is going to happen. That is precisely my worry, because I belong to an era where the internet was just beginning. Our cell phone was that big. It's now that you have these small things, and we didn't have smartphones, far from it. So the communication revolution in India came later. So did the internet revolution. And that is, we are now getting accustomed or used to working in that atmosphere, that surrounding. And we suddenly find ourselves with this new freedom of the social media. And we don't quite know how to handle it as a privacy issue. And we don't quite know how to handle it as an intelligence security issue. How do you match the two? What do you give up more? Whether you give up security and let it be free, or you clamp down on security, clamp down on privacy and go for security. I mean, we don't have the capacity that the United States has to download everything up there. We don't have the means to download it. We don't have the means to process it further. So we have the typical problem of a country growing, wanting to achieve greatness, but without the adequate means to do it just now. This is going to be a problem for the future generations of intelligence chiefs and intelligence organizations and the security establishment of the country. Thank God I'm out of it.
Can I come back on
Please,
one thing?
please.
Just a couple of things I wanted to come back on, which have just been picked up here. There obviously is a massive proliferation of technology. And, looking at the US intelligence budget, we can see it deployed. And GCHQ, of course, costs quite a penny too. But if you look at the security threats to countries, they're increasingly analog. And if you look at the best research methods, both as journalists and indeed in intelligence organizations, they too are analog. And although there is a culture of digital journalism, which I salute, and it's brought great scandals to the fore, knowing people and being unafraid to talk to them and finding the right people, I think still remains actually the greatest challenge. And it's a message that I often come back to, that self-censorship amongst people who explore new regions and new ideas is why things don't get discovered, rather than actually finding the right people, whoever they are. They may be the worst pathological killers in the world, but actually seeking them out is part of the process of exploring, and that remains with the state a challenge too. Finding the right people who will continue to be adventurous and inquisitive, and seek out that information, whether it be as writers or as intelligence people. And so I would like to foreground analog. I say to journalism students when I work with them, think analog. Get rid of all of the technology that's around you and get out of this room and explore the real world that's around you, because context provides a key to everything. And the more subtle that context, we talked yesterday about understanding the mind of the person who's talking to you. And actually that missing component often will provide far more context in anything that you write up.
The machine won't give you that.
The machine won't give you that, even though AI is wonderfully, wonderfully advanced. And the second point, which dovetails with this, is near and far. Obviously, as we know through the evolution of certain kinds of psychology and psychological theory, the near threat and the far threat is a curse for everyone. That's why climate change is so unexciting to governments. Whereas Al-Qaeda right now is a super great funding flag to put up on your mast. And so the same goes for recognizing where to place yourself in the future, what it is you're working towards. And I believe that near and far and the human limitations to visualize the next threat is a classic example of that. So when we were ensconced in Britain in a war against Ireland, and at the same time America was ensconced in Gulf War II and the Presler Agreement had come about, slamming the door on Pakistan, no one was thinking about Al-Qaeda. But actually in 92, 93 and 94, all the seeds were laid for a grand slam of Islamism to come about.
February, you had the first attack on WT.
Totally. And yet, those pieces were all stashed in different silos and not brought into the mainstream of an argument. And in fact, still weren't and were being argued about in the White House after September the 11th. And so the near threat and the far threat is, in fact, one of the great conundrums, both for writers and for spies.
The agencies,
yeah,
it is a big problem.
Please.
First of all, I would like to compliment Mr. Sood for writing this excellent book. I, for one, had always had a very strong reservation about any intelligence officer writing a book. But after browsing through, I haven't read this book word to word, but I have also certainly gone through this book. And I feel that it is a very, very significant contribution by Mr. Sood. And such type of contribution was necessary both for intelligence officers as well as for general public who are interested in the functioning of intelligence organizations. As Mr. Sood have said, that this book has not been written with the purpose of only for intelligence professionals, but I will say that this book is a must for all intelligence professionals. It's a must book for all intelligence professionals. And while he says that there's no masala in it, but I think there's quite a bit of masala in it and makes a very interesting reading for a common person also. Now, about emerging challenges which he has mentioned and which has been discussed here also, I will just say that, of course, we are living in a dynamic world situations, things are changing. But in the last 15, 20 years, with the advent of this IT revolution, the pace of change has accelerated manifold, I will say. So we cannot ignore these changes, but bureaucracy in general is status quoist, and that had seeped into intelligence also. So this is the biggest challenge, that for an intelligence agency, we have not only to prepare ourselves for the change situation, but also to anticipate the situation, emerging situation next 3 years, 5 years, and prepare to meet those challenges. And for that, proper training, proper, all those things are required. While I will say that all these new technologies, new type of intelligence, tech-int, etc., have come in. I will say here that we should not forget the basics of intelligence work. There I will slightly differ with what Mr. Sood has defined, I will say. I'll say that all intelligence operations per se are covert operations, with inbuilt mechanism of deniability. Now, all intelligence operations are conducted with certain objective. First objective could be collection of intelligence. And second objective could be anything but collection of intelligence. And in the second type of operations, also intelligence is collected as a byproduct. Mr. Sood has mentioned the first type of operations, clandestine operations rather than covert operations. I will say that all intelligence operations are covert operations. Now, Indrani has mentioned about this new age of covert operations. We have quoted that about media warfare, about legal warfare, about cyber and all that. These are new forms of warfare, and which, like anything other, also it is overt and covert aspect of this. What the example you give, it was not a covert war, it was an overt warfare by the Chinese. So if it is, it should not appear, if it has to be done covertly, then nobody should know who is behind this thing. And that is the job which is intelligence organization has to perform. So in all these areas, as if covert means nobody should be able to, who is behind these operations. Now, coming to the biggest challenge vis-a-vis our neighbors, I will only say that the biggest challenge is our own mindset vis-a-vis our neighbors, as well as our inability to clearly distinguish between covert and overt operations. What should be done overtly and what should be done covertly? That we have to very clearly distinguish, because we appear to be interfering blatantly in their internal affairs, which create an anti-India feeling over there. That's all I would like to add.
Mr. Sood, first of all, I wish to compliment your book. My name is Vijay Jolly. I wish to know, as a former Raw Chief, what would be and what were your... It's okay. Okay. First of all, I would wish to compliment you for your book, The Unending Game, as the former Raw Chief. But I would also wish to know, as far as your experiences, what would you consider as the biggest challenge? The CIA of America, or the KGB of Russia, or the Mossad of Israel, or the espionage cover-up covert operations of China, in the past and in the current scenario? We would wish to be enlightened of your personal experiences on this particular aspect. Thank you.
Want me to reply?
Go ahead.
All intelligence agencies work for espionage on friend and foe alike. So when we think of another intelligence agency, you may have relations with them, you may have good relations with them, but a good intelligence agency does not forget that you are also liable to be suborned by them. And superpowers use their intelligence agencies far more extensively for coverage of things other than pure intelligence collection. And we have known that in the past, both the KGB and the CIA were very active in India, they probably still are, to create an atmosphere which favors them through NGOs, through media, through their own journals, radio transmissions, TV transmissions. All these are tactics that they use. So whether you want to call them as, sorry, excuse me, threats to you or not it depends on how their system operates. But they're going to be using that. Mossad would do it. The Chinese we would do it. They would do it. So it's a game that we are playing, and I would not define them as threats. I would define them as that they're doing their job and I'm going to do mine.
Yeah, my name is Ashok Mehta. I'm a retired general. And I just want to take off from where you left in the beginning about India not having either the military or the industrial complex. And therefore we are or were late starters in this game. What I think you need to add to this is the element of morality, because I think in the early stages of our development, we were guided more by, can you sell weapons? It's immoral to sell weapons. Should you spy on others? Well, it's immoral to do that. So I think this element of morality was built into your system. Now, I think the new elements we have actually in the last couple of years picked up a lot. And I would say that in South Asia, especially, the score is 2-1. And to add to one of the our weaknesses, or two weaknesses, former colleague, well, not your colleague, but an IB chief who was a national security advisor after 9/11 said that we just didn't have the capacity to do the things that we needed to do. We had no options. Our only option was no option. Can you believe this, that we had absolutely no option after 9/11 other than to start a war?
2611.
26/11, yeah, other than to start a war. And he says it plainly that we didn't have the capacity, we don't have the capacity, and we will celebrate Surgical Strike Day on 29th of September. Why? Because we went in 2 to 5 kilometers inside Pakistan, an operation that, by the way, I'm not saying it wasn't a good operation. It was a great operation without any casualties. But the fact is, it was denied by Pakistan, not surprisingly, and it had no effect on either curbing or eliminating cross-border terrorism. So, in short, it's a tactical capability. So we do not have the strategic capacity. And to come to finish off, I want to get back to this score 2-1. I didn't know that this outcome of Maldives, if it is what it is, and I've been traveling in Sri Lanka at least thrice or four times a year. And what happened in 2015, I think we should pat ourselves on the back to some extent. What has happened in Nepal? We've lost the game in Nepal. The Chinese we were the predominant player. Our agencies were the predominant players. We've lost out on that. And it has also got something to do with the economics of it, the deep pocket, which we do not have. So we have another minus point is our deep pocket, the lack of our shallow pockets, shall I say. And therefore, again, that constrains the quality, or what the word Indrani used, the strategic nature of the operation that we are capable of doing. So overall, I think we are beginning to learn the game, and but for that we need resources. And if we are not going to invest resources, then we'll keep doing what we are doing, tactical operations.
Can I just add to a question to what General Mehta has asked you? You know, this business about we don't have the capacity. It's not as though 2611 was the first terrorist attack which happened in India. We've been facing the fires of terrorism from the early 80s. Uh, and the thing is that it doesn't take rocket science to know that you must have a capacity to hit back and hit back hard to deter the enemy. So I want to ask you, what is the reason that we have never really applied our mind to developing this capacity, and that the only option is, as General Mehta says, you either go to war or you just roll over and play dead, or retaliate by threatening to retaliate. Uh, what is this obtuseness? Is it a governmental failure? Is it a systemic failure?
It's a
I forgot to ask my question. And my question is it true that in 1997 or 96, that we did have certain capabilities across the border, and that we did, as a gesture of the game of morality that we were playing, or non-reciprocity, that was the term that was used, that we dismantled those capabilities that we had built up?
No, that's a difficult question to answer. A lot of people have said that it was called off. The policy was of restraint, and that's how it happened. And off the record, I can say that it wasn't shut down. The political will changed, and hasn't changed again after that. So we still, that's my impression, being out of the government now, and that's how it is. So we don't do things on our own. The ISI can. They can carry out Kargil and Mumbai and not let the Prime Minister know. In India, we are a democracy. We will never ever do that. So it has all boils down to your decision, political decision at the top, how you want to treat your neighbors, whether it's Pakistan or Nepal or China or Bangladesh or even China. Capacities can be built, can be developed. You can hide them for some time, use them when you like. And in fact, such capacities are built only in peacetime. You can't build them when the war is on. You must have the luxury of time to do it, and it takes time to do all this. So I don't know what happened then. And there was another question. Have I answered everything? Maybe I have. You were asking something.
No, I asked about these capacities, that if we don't have these capacities, then what is the reason that over the last 30, 35 years, we haven't built these capacities? So,
As the general said, it's a question of morality. No? We think that we can convince others by being nice to them. And we're so excited or sad that, if we had had this talk with the Pakistani foreign minister, he would have given us passage to Kartarpur. I mean, it's the glib talking to the gullible. Nothing is going to change, and we have to accept that and then act accordingly. We don't do that. We think that isi se baat chal jayegi.
I would just like to add, said just I'm Sanjeev Tripathi, I didn't mention earlier, and I worked in the organization for a long period, like Mr. Sood, for 34 years before retiring as chief. About capacity you have mentioned. The thing is, we always had capacity, but why should it be discussed outside? If you want to know about our capacity, just see what ISI talks about us. Why should it be discussed? Capacity is there, we do our work quietly, we don't claim it, and that is actually the covert operation. After 26/11, the government wanted something demonstrative to show it to our own population. So our covert actions there, which we would not claim, I'm just disclosing because I was part of the government that the intention was to do something overt, to placate our population that yes, we are also capable of doing something. It had nothing to do with the covert capability of R&AW, which is there, and I feel that it should not at all be discussed and questioned in public. The organization, you must have faith in the organization. There may be ups and downs, governments change, but such organization, they do not give up their capability. They have the capacity, there may be ups and downs, but certainly they are there. But that is not meant for political placating our own population.
Actually, intelligence organisations historically, I mean, I can't talk to your experience, they change seismically along with the governments that get elected. One only has to look at the guerrilla warfare that's being waged right now between the Trump administration and the intelligence services of all varieties to see who can outleak and outtweet who in this death throw that's going on in Washington. And in the UK, it's definitely happened where intelligence agencies have attempted to steer very, very subtly certain weak political pacts. I mean, everyone's been reporting in the UK about a very interesting issue that occurred in the 1970s when a politician who was a known child abuser, secrecy was maintained around him by the Internal Security Service in order that a very delicate political pact, which required his voting presence, wasn't broken up. And so there is political stewardship that takes place, and it does alter the nature of the organisations. Obviously, 2003 is the most important period to look at, 2002, and the way in which that dossier came into being. That certainly met the needs of the University of Chicago taught clique of neoconservatives who wanted the war in Iraq, and it changed the nature of the intelligence service, who were politicised in producing it. Not the analysts, I say, who decried that happening, but the people who presented the...
Dear Love's famous comedy.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So I think that, while I appreciate the goal of what you're saying, that, there is this rock-solid foundation, actually governments do extraordinary damage to their often to their own internal bureaucracies. And I just wanted to finish with one observation based on all of this conversation, and yet again come back to technology versus your ideas about modernisation. Seeing is not knowing, and I think as an investigator, as a writer, as an intelligence officer, seeing is not knowing. It is only acquiring stuff that you then have to put somewhere. It has to mean something. And so for all of this data, I looked at all of the information that we recovered from Al-Qaeda itself in the period of 9/11. And lo and behold, their bureaucracy and their understanding was far, far surpassed that of all the intelligence agencies who were observing them from the outside. Seeing is not knowing, and providing more analytic ability will be the key to everything. More brain power, more skills, more modernisation.
Yeah. If you have X number of machines to download material,
Yeah.
and you got to have, algorithms will not solve everything. You have to have skilled manpower which will look at and interpret it. I mean, even the tone of the talk that you intercept makes a difference.
Yeah.
It may read differently when you write it down. When he's speaking, he's under duress, or he's making it up, or he's lying. An experienced listener will know that. So you cannot just take the human element out of this at all. So you have to be very careful how much you want to download.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm Dr. Geeta, and I work on China and in JNU. And of course, I teach Chinese also, so I know about how the Chinese language work. And interestingly, you were talking about the Doklam issue, and you were talking about the three warfares. But to my understanding, I think the three warfares about media, the psychological, probably is well known in the Indian, circles. We understand that there is certain kind of media warfare being played by the Chinese. But I think there are two other kinds of things. One, of course, the emerging one in terms of the cyber warfare, which is going to become a very critical, area, which I think we need to build capacities on, and maybe your thoughts on that. But the other factor probably, which we really don't discuss so much, is of the ideological warfare. And I would want to know your comments on that. How are we going to really, because now, I mean, as I see the kind of changes that are happening in China, and I work a little bit on Nepal as well, the kind of changes are happening in more on the ideological inclination towards the Chinese way of doing things rather than what we have been talking in India. So what do you think? How are we going to deal with those kinds of challenges in the new changing world? Thanks.
I'd like to just take on from where General Mehta was mentioning about the surgical strike. In my opinion, the surgical strike was a very correct intelligence operation. You know, what we had built up to how we acquired that intelligence, the human, the electronic intelligence, all sorts of intelligence was put together. And, to make sure that at the last moment there were no changes, you have to verify if the human is authentic. All this has happened, and therefore this operation was a success. So we're building up more on the execution of an operation, and I don't know why we're not talking of the intelligence success. And if we have had that success, why are you not building up on that? Or we don't have the capacities to utilize that sort of intelligence that we have today. The other point, that came up was that the only capacities you're building up is to go to a military campaign against the Chinese, against the Pakistanis. I asked one of the army commanders once. I was just a brigadier then. I said, "Sir, what are you going to do? How are you going to defeat this challenge that India is facing of terrorism as you an army commander in so and so place?" He says, "We'll destroy the ARN, that's the Army Reserve North." I said, "How will that stop terrorism?" So, the two thoughts are not going together. They're not complementary. The military objective for a political aim is not in sync with what we want to do. And therefore, just building up military capacity is not going to reduce this issue. This problem is not going to go away. And so whom do we target? I've been wondering, why can't we target these, after the surgical strikes, actually the first thing is that all these uh, group leaders should be running for cover, and they should not be visible anywhere on the horizon in Pakistan. But they are. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not happened. So they do not have, I mean, they feel that we can do a one-off such operation, but we cannot sustain it and we cannot continue to do it. The third issue is, there are a lot of intelligence information, or you get intelligence, but there are times when you can't disclose, or you may even actually accept casualties. An example of this was, the German code, which was the Nazi army code, which was broken by the Britishers, Enigma. And there were times when Churchill knew that this is going to the British operation or the English operation, Allied operation is going to be a failure, because the Germans are there and these people do not know it, and he still did not interfere in that, because that would have given away a larger picture. So all these things, we still do not have that. We, politically are very immature. That's the problem with us. And we cannot tackle issues which are very large and which need sustained thought. Thank you.
Last your book I attended, so I know and got your book also. My two questions, sir. The first one is about the role of private sector in the intelligence gathering and whatever the agencies do. I would like to know that how much now the governments are taking help of private sector in doing their work, in doing whatever they do. And the second is about okay, I will stick to the first question, not others.
First one was about, I think your basic question is about narratives. How do you influence narratives? And if you if you reach that stage, I've talked about controlling the narrative. And it's really cyber. Sustained cyber, not just like we do it. Remember, I think it was before your time, much before your time, 1965, when we have Bangla, Indo-Pak War, that radio broadcast, uh, what was it called? Dol Kapol, something like that. And it was Mia Dandorchi on the other side, and well, that was cyber. Keep the morale up. But cyber is long-term, subtle, takes into account everything. It is how are you going to make the other person think the way you want him to think. Nowadays, the Americans tried MK Ultra, control of the mind. I believe it's still on. I don't know. Anyhow, but now with WhatsApp and with social media, you can change minds in a few minutes. You can start a riot in 10 places. So those are the things that are going to happen. And handling China means a lot of hard work here. I don't know whether we have the capacity to do that kind of cyber against a country which has closed its doors to you. It doesn't let in anything. You get to know of the Uyghur revolt or something in passing after a few months. We don't get to know. What happens in America today, you get to know tomorrow. Because that's the difference between democracies and closed societies. Uh, so narrative is something that we have to learn to play fully all the time. And it's not just Pakistan, it's not just Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, it is about the major countries. And unless we have a voice of our own, that's always been my sort of goal or campaign. Unless you have a voice of your own, like the Voice of America used to be, or like BBC World Service is, or even the CNN is, unless you have that, how do you beam your information, your viewpoint, your values outside? And it's no good just talking about how good we were 5,000 years ago. People want to know now, what are you on about? What are you going to be? That's what they want to know. And if we are only going to be talking about rape and so on and so forth in the foreign media and encourage them ourselves to write about it, then we are playing their game. So that's our other thing. General Saab, I would define our Uri counter attack as not a surgical strike. Because to me, surgical strike means that your strike has made the opposition change its policy. You've actually hived off something, surgical. I think it was more a punitive raid. It was more a tactical raid, not really a surgical strike. And well, that's a matter of definition. That's a matter of definition, not really um, a solution. And also, I agree that one-off is no good. If you're going down that path, then you got to keep doing it, and keep taking the response to that. Do we have the capacity to do that? I don't know.
The point is, my emphasis was on the intelligence, which was very good.
Yeah.
And I was actually wanting to know, are we building up on that? And if we
Really,
have,
quite honestly, I don't know. I really don't know because I don't talk to anyone about what's going on in their departments. I don't think they want to tell me. They think I'm nosing around to find out what's going on now in the system and what compared to what it was in mine. No, I never talk about that. And I don't think Sanjeev talks about it either anyway. We just keep away from this. So we can't give you authentic current information. We are out of date in that sense.
I am Atul Gandotra. I am from business world. I am not from intelligence or forces and all that. but I belong to J&K State, so when you talk about this, intelligence all interests me a lot. I have a few questions. One is, sir, that you have done this book, with what objective and for whom? So how it's going to benefit me, your book? I'm not an intelligence man. So if I read this book, what kind of benefit I'm going to accrue, which can be maybe spread across in my society, and it serves the society some cause. Number one question. Number two is that when we talk about intelligence, we find there's a big issue of this Maoist in India. It's a very big issue for the last so many years altogether. In fact, there was in this place only, there was a discussion on 50 years of, action against Maos and all that. We are not able to do anything on that. Is it again a poor political will or lack of capability or abilities? And when we talk about, other countries like China is going here, China is going there, US is going there, US going there, because they are economic powers, as General Mehta has very rightly said, that they have deep pockets. I don't have. But is it that if I don't have deep pockets, I keep on crying till the time my deep pockets would not be there? I'll always talk that, oh, I couldn't do that during my tenure. I don't know what's going to happen future also. What is the course, of progression we are getting into as a nation, which is on par with anybody in terms of intelligence, and that is seen and felt by a commoner. That's his interest. Thank you, sir.
First question. I think I said in the beginning that my book is not meant for professionals. It's meant to educate or arouse the interest of the average inquisitive Indian to learn what intelligence is about, how it operates, and generally help them understand the world of intelligence and also the problems that are going to occur in the future. My only purpose was that. My purpose was nothing else beyond giving you a glimpse of the world I lived in without bringing myself into it. As far as the Maoists are concerned, this is something we've had since independence in some way. You had the Telangana communists in 1947, you had Naxalbari in 1967, and so on. And now you have this tri-state problem. There are, of course, problems of resources. We don't have adequate resources, but that is not the issue. The issue is, how are you going to tackle this issue where it is not just the ideologue who's involved, it is the tribal who's been suborned, and it is the politician who's in the picture, and there is also the contractor. So there are lots of interests involved in this, that it is not easy for the Indian state to break through. But there have been successes. In Andhra, they were able to overcome it. And I think there are now more successes in Chhattisgarh, I think. All over there is. It's a long haul. It takes a few years for the problem to occur, but it takes much longer to cure it, because insurgencies and terrorisms are ugly. Because the counter-insurgent and counter-terrorist cannot be that ugly. He has to observe certain regulations, certain rules of human rights, and so on and so forth. So it's not easy to tackle terrorism. It's very difficult, in fact. It's not easily identifiable, as you know. You belong to J&K, you know how difficult it is. So we have just got to... No insurgency, no terrorism can defeat a state if the state has the will to overcome it. I think we're getting there.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on, the sentence that you mentioned, that espionage is is an endless game without rules and few winners. And obviously, the democratic state cannot settle for that. It needs to insist on the rule of law and on transparency. I would like to hear your opinion on this question, because obviously if there are different rules that apply for intelligence agencies than for other organizations within the state, but accountability has to be there. So, and if this is not happening to the necessary extent, then you're producing systems as the deep state, if you can call it a system. What are your, what are your thoughts as a practitioner on this? How to control intelligence agencies from a democratic point of view?
Can I just take one final question and then we can have closing comments from all of the panel?
Very simple question. Could you just explain whether India should build up a capacity like GCHQ over a period of time?
But it is.
Sorry?
It is.
Okay. Good.
Accountability is an issue that keeps coming up again. When I refer to no rules, I don't talk about accountability. I'm talking about me as an officer of the Indian external intelligence working in another country. I have no rules there, because I am ab initio violating the rule of that country. So I'm doing an illegal act. So there are no laws for me if I'm caught. Right? So I'm referring to laws only in that sense. I'm not referring to accountability. Of course, there has to be some accountability. The point is accountability to who? And to what extent? Well, that is, of course, a larger debate. And I don't want to go into all that. We are all accountable for something or the other in life. As we grow up, as a child, you're accountable to your parent, and you listen to him, you carry on what he tells you to do most of the time. And then the teacher, then the boss. So there is that accountability or responsibility that goes on in life. Therefore, you are accountable to somebody who you think is superior, if not your peer. Right? Now, I want to be accountable only to professionals who empathize, who understand, who will look at accountability not as a whip, but as a means to rectify and improve. That is accountability. Merely saying, how much have you spent? Oh, you should have taken out tenders for this source report and you spent too much. That's not it. That doesn't solve my problem. So we can debate on this some other time, a long debate. Thanks.
Can I make one point? I think it's a really serious point that you raise about rules-bound systems. And I think that when we've come through this period of a perceived war on terror from 2001 and until the Abbottabad raid, what we saw was the undoing of the rules-bound system, and that involved accountability to the people and the governments. So we had a system of renditions and black sites that did everything it could to evade international regulation and domestic law.
Even the surveillance.
Yeah, the surveillance in itself. And I think that, the knock-on, rather than that being seen as desperate measures for desperate times, the knock-on for that was that the rules of war were suspended for everyone else. And so then we saw a system of butchery that took place whereby the sanctity of a prisoner of war and civilians like journalists and aid workers in the field, there was open season on all of us because there was no system to support even in these desperate times. And I feel that that was one of the most radical misunderstandings of the nature of how to respond to Al-Qaeda. to actually dismantle all of our international agreements. That's not to say that, we think that there should be no response, that, that we should be weak surrenderists who back away. But what did happen bypassed a lot of what had been carefully ratcheted and set up in terms of, international relations, but also domestic law. How much was known by America itself until the first clandestine Senate hearing in 2011, 2012, and then the redacted report of 2014? We're still trying to get to the bottom of what happened during that epoch. And that is not the answer either. Being overly strong in a covert manner that disregards law has proven to be a failure, a total failure.
Indrani?
I go back to what we talked about in the beginning, which was the two issues which I thought need more fleshing out. One is the area of strategic communication that Mr. Sood mentions in his book, and that has, I think, has an effect on, one, response time, but two, on being able to assess or being able to foretell a threat or a challenge that is not evident on the horizon. And I can't emphasize how important it is, because we obviously nobody knows, but unless we are prepared for a range of outcomes or a range of consequences, we will keep being surprised, and it would take so much more of state capacity to deal with challenges, small challenges, larger challenges, at least in India's neighborhood. And these challenges are going to continue to be there in whatever form. I mean, Nepal will continue to be a challenge. It has always been a challenge. But do we now say, oh, okay, we are okay there for the time being, let's just build 5 roads and we should be all right? I don't think so. You will be surprised by Yamin putting the Supreme Court justice in jail. It will be one of those, but it didn't happen out of nowhere. And the point that I make always is, we keep being surprised. And I don't think we have as we grow as a nation, I don't think we have the luxury to keep being surprised in our own neighborhood every time.
I think on that note, that hopefully we are not going to always play catch up, and maybe we'll be actually a step ahead. We'll anticipate what is likely to happen, we'll game it, and without without the intelligence agencies or the security services being able to do something like that, you will always end up playing catch up, which is not a good place to be in. The second problem is that once you start playing catch up, you actually start preparing for what has already happened.
Last year.
You are not still in this game of preparing for what might happen. But so, for example, we keep hearing about what will India do if the next 2611 happens. There will never again be a 2611. It'll be something else, will be similar. It won't be a 2611. What will be that something else is what I would imagine, people from your fraternity need to be thinking about 24/7. I don't know if they are doing it, and I don't know if they have the luxury of time to do it. But I suppose that is what they have to do. But that is, even then, that's not the larger strategic challenges which either countries or intelligence agencies will face. And the larger strategic challenges are some of which you mention in your book about the new trends which are coming in. How do you look at that? The new challenges which are coming in. What Mr. Levy mentions, none of the old problems have gone, and there are many new problems which have come up. In the old days, you settled one problem and then another problem came up. But today, it's not like that. So it's a far more dynamic world. It's a far more dangerous world. And I am not so sure if our security services are actually being equipped to meet the challenges of this this very dangerous new world. And on that note, I think we'll end this session out here, just about in time.